Hello there, a very good evening. This is Face the Nation. I'm Sonali Vanigapadge. Now, as Sri Lanka attempts at this game of mega development projects and accelerated growth, one needs to consider the phenomenal stake held by global players, regional players, specifically players such as China, which is moving towards world domination. Now, from the Rubber Rice Pact of 1952 between the Sri Lankan and Chinese governments to China's massive role in post-war reconstruction of Sri Lanka to present-day trade relations, where are we really headed? We are told so often of the massive infrastructure that China has invested in Sri Lanka. So what does the future really hold for Sri Lanka in terms of development, in terms of sovereignty, in terms of bargaining power, in terms of regional development, really? So to find out several opinions on this, we have invited on our show tonight several eminent guests. Dr. Harinda Vidanage, he is the director at the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies, or BCIS. Good evening and welcome, Doctor.
Good evening.
We also have with us Dr. Subhashini Abe Singha. She is the research director at Verite Research. Good evening to you. Finally joining us is George Cook. He's the Deputy Director at BCIS. Good evening and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
My first question is to Dr. Harinda Vidanage. Dr. Vidanage, speaking at the Davos Forum, the World Economic Forum in Davos last year, China's President Xi Jinping said, we Chinese know only too well what it takes to achieve prosperity, so we applaud the achievements of others and we wish them a better future. We are not jealous of others' success and we will not complain about the others who have benefited. We will welcome them aboard the express train of Chinese development. So this express train of Chinese development, how is it impacting Sri Lanka? In your opening remarks, if you could just take 3 minutes to explain to us, there is massive infrastructure development in Sri Lanka, Chinese investments. How do we view this?
Well, we have to understand what China's infrastructure development policies are about, looking from a regional and global perspective to understand how it's impacting Sri Lanka. So especially after President Xi Jinping came to power since 2013, he has been promoting a very ambitious policy, which we are still trying to understand, because there are two verse narratives. I mean, there are more narratives, but the two narratives are, he has a very ambitious regional and a global economic project, which is trying to connect China to the region as well as rest of the world by revitalizing the historic Chinese Silk Route along with the Chinese maritime Silk Route. So that is what they call the One Belt, One Road. The belt stands for the land route, the road actually stands for the maritime Silk Route. So in that context, they have created an ambitious plan to create what they call prosperity to all. The idea of a harmonious world, the idea that the world should develop, what you said, that what you kind of like to cite from Davos. So what China has been trying to do is create a political, economic, strategic model that is trying to link to the rest of the world. As part of this, infrastructure development in key identified regions has become a economic and a strategic priority in the Chinese government. So under that, the Chinese have identified not just Sri Lanka. If you look, Sri Lanka is part of the maritime Silk Route. So if you take the One Belt, One Road, we are on the road map, not on the belt map. So on the road map, they have identified certain dots that they think would connect, that they could connect at the end, and they have identified that would bring prosperity to China as well as the countries that they have identified. So that starts from Fushu, China, it comes to Cambodia, it comes through to Kolkata, it comes to through Hambantota, then it goes towards Mombasa to Djibouti, like that. So part of that, they have identified all these countries. One of the major things that could vitalize these countries and make them key connecting nodes is that if these countries have significant developmental infrastructure, right, which will serve the country as well as serve China's intentions, which China's ambitions of connecting, creating a maritime Silk Route where China also can benefit. So in that context, China has been they have been focusing a lot on developing ports in Sri Lanka. So you have the port city, you have Hambantota, as well as other infrastructure projects. So most of these infrastructure projects and the money that is coming in as loans, as grants, mostly as loans, has been towards achieving this end, right? This particular idea of China's connectivity with the rest of the world. So we can discuss as we move along the program whether this is an economic overture, whether this is a strategic overture, but that is how it has come to Sri Lanka as part of that overarching policy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vidanage. Shifting gears, Dr. Subhashini Abe Singha, your area of expertise is trade. Do you think that this strategy adopted by China, we've seen how they invest in countries sometimes unable to service their loans. Sometimes we see countries making stupid borrowing decisions. How is Sri Lanka to safeguard its own domestic interests?
Thank you. So first I would like to correct, I'm not Dr. Subhashini Abe Singha. So just to get on to the question, basically I think what we need to also understand is China is a country like Dr. Harindra said, it is actually a country that is seeking to connect with the world to safeguard its own interests. Especially in the Indian Ocean, one of the major concerns of China is its energy security, because over 70% of China's energy needs, the oil and gas actually pass through the Indian Ocean, and about 80% of China's imports and exports go through the Indian Ocean. So China has always been extremely concerned about the vulnerability, especially because of the Strait of Malacca, which is a choke point, and where China has considered that in the event of some disturbance, that is a place where Chinese security as well as economic interests can be threatened. So therefore China is China's maritime Silk Route, which is where Sri Lanka is a very important partner in, has come to basically safeguard this freedom of navigation and also to ensure its own security. So energy security and economic security as well. So it's just that Sri Lanka happens to be in this very strategically located position near the east-west shipping route, and we have historically being a hub which provides connectivity to the Indian subcontinent, Middle East and Africa. So obviously for any country that is seeking to ensure its economic interests in the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka is a very attractive location, and positioning itself in Sri Lanka also provides access to China to the Indian subcontinent, Middle East and Africa, and as a global economic power. Definitely that is the reason why China sees Sri Lanka obviously as an important destination. And also when it comes to investments, so China's Belt and Road Initiative is a lot about massive infrastructure projects, but at the same time we are in a region where there is a huge infrastructure gap and huge demand for infrastructure development, which the existing donors actually can't meet. So therefore Sri Lanka also has definitely a huge need for infrastructure development, in ports to roads to energy to in every aspect.
But this development has to be sustainable, right?
Yes, that is what is very important. It's not only the funds that is important, but also the having feasible, viable projects that to fund is equally important. So determining the right projects that will actually be in the interest of the country is what is very important, and that is where countries like Sri Lanka struggle to figure out what projects should be prioritized and when.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ms. Subhashini Abhisinghe, Research Director at Verite Research, for your thoughts in the first round. I move my attention now to George Cook. He's the Deputy Director at BCIS. George, can you speak to us about the evolution of foreign policy in Sri Lanka, and is there a change in recent times?
When we talk about foreign policy in Sri Lanka, and we are going back to pre-independence, the pre-independence period, 1947, we are probably taking one of our most critical stances at that point when we signed 3 agreements with the British just before they give us independence. From that point of understanding, you also got to understand the dynamics in play within Sri Lanka. Many tend to identify the first 3 prime ministers as being pro-Western in terms of their outlook, in terms of their relations with the world. But you've also got to understand the circumstances under which they were forced into that particular situation. We are in the mid-1940s, and the then Indian Prime Minister makes a statement about Ceylon being very similar to India in terms of culture, language, religion. You can imagine the fear that arises in the mind of the first Prime Minister. He's also the Defence Minister at the time. So D.S. Senanayake has to broker a deal with the British at that point. And this is probably where we start off our foreign policy dealings in contemporary times. And of course we can go back centuries and talk about our interactions from the times of the kings and onwards. But of course, from 1947 through to all key developments that have taken place under varying leaders of this country, we've always understood that national interest has got to come first. We've been some of the key architects of non-alignment, but we've also steered away from non-alignment. We've been at the forefront of promoting relations within the region. We've also been founding members, for example, of SAARC, but we've also looked at associations outside. We've looked at trying to attract investment from across the world, and this is not limited to one particular region. As a small country, Sri Lanka is not in the position, and has not been in the position, and will not be in the position into the future to identify particular countries of greater importance than others. As a small country, we need all countries in the world. This whole one vote system within the United Nations makes it imperative that we have extremely close dealings within our ability with as many countries as possible around the world, irrespective of their positions of power, irrespective of their economic status, irrespective of their own dynamics within, and irrespective of the way they are regarded by certain countries. We've seen that, for example, throughout the 60s and 70s, coming into the 80s. At the height of the non-aligned movement, we worked extremely closely with countries which in the last 10, 15 years have not been regarded extremely favorably. So Sri Lanka has always had to focus on the fact that national interest comes first. Irrespective of opinion out there in the world, irrespective of developments, we've got to understand what is in the best interest of this country. Because if not, if our leaders don't decide what is in the best interest of our country, who will?
Right. Thank you very much, George Cook, for your thoughts. I open the floor now for questions from our journalists. We are joined by Charita Fernando and Naveem Majid. Charita, let's start off with you.
Thank you, Sonali. My first question is to Dr. Vidanage. We see China acquiring port infrastructure in regional countries and also building military capabilities, right? So, and there is a bloc, the US, Japan, India, trying to counter that. Do you see this situation evolving or developing into a militarization of the Indian Ocean region? Do you think that will happen?
Well, let's take this straight. There are certain facts. So we are moving into an extremely geopolitically intense future. There is no doubt about that. That is because, not just because China is acquiring ports, it's because there is a significant vacuum in a global leadership. You can see a American recession plus an American withdrawal from what the US used to do and used to lead, right? That is partly because of the limiting ideational and material capabilities the US has had, and plus the current administration's disinterest in being leading global governance initiatives. So which is creating a massive vacuum within the global governance system, where there is so many emerging powers as well as what we call revisionist powers such as Russia. They're all interested in grabbing a bigger stake in global affairs. So definitely it's going to be a significantly geopolitically intense world. So we're talking in that context, and in that context when you take the Indian Ocean, right, and now if you look at what the United States did a few weeks ago, the US military renamed our region as a their command was Pacific Command. There was no command for the Indian Ocean. They recreated their command structure into Indo-Pacific. So it shows there is significant strategic interest. India is actually expanding its naval capabilities as well as naval presence. There are 7 Indian Navy missions that's taking place, which is covering most of the Indian Ocean and going into close to Africa as well as towards East Asia. So that is all a sign of these regional competitions. Some of them have global implications, such as what you're seeing in the Middle East, such as the competition for power between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Turkey. So likewise, when you take Asia, there is significantly a competition for some kind of regional power acquiring. I don't like the term domination. I think we are not getting there yet, but there is India, there is China, there is Australia, there is Indonesia. I mean, these are countries we normally don't focus on. They all have significant ambitions. If you read their defense and security white papers, that's what they want. So in that context, yes. So China, I think what Subhashini said was right. One of China's major interests is making sure its economic prosperity, because if China is the second fastest growing economy in the world, it needs the energy and the fuel to sustain it. One, to make sure its goods reach the rest of the world. So, 2, it needs to make sure it gets the energy it needs, the fuel, the energy security. So in that context, it's creating a strategic set of dots that it can connect, which it can access. That doesn't mean China would militarize Hambantota or Guada or Kairukfu or Piraeus. That means China wants to consolidate its presence in those regions, in the countries that it is building those ports. In the long run, there can be militarization, but not around the ports, but around the ocean systems. I don't think, for example, China want to militarize the Sri Lankan port, because China's ambitions are not 5 years ahead. Its ambitions are about 35 years ahead. So they're very pragmatic about India's presence. So I don't see in the immediate future China militarizing these ports, but there will be increased militarization across the ocean systems that these ports are present, right? So there are two words. It's militarization as well as weaponization. So militarization is the increased military presence. The secondary thing is the more worrying thing. Will that militarization lead to increased weaponization? For example, there can be submarines, but will it increase nuclear armed submarines? That's the weaponization aspect of it. So
in case there is an escalation of militarization, if we assume, and we have these power blocks, India, the United States, Japan, Australia, and then China. Now Sri Lanka is a relatively small economy. We are under the influence of, under the shadows of the big giants. So do you think we will have to take a side, or can we be neutral and survive? How can we navigate through this?
I don't think we can afford to take a side, because if you are seeing an the most challenging thing for Sri Lanka's foreign policy, I think George can talk more about, but I'm not the foreign policy expert, but would be handling this intense geopolitical competition. So if you are having an intense geopolitical competition as a small power, the last thing you want to do is take a side. when that competition unravels. So navigating it would be the challenge Sri Lanka would have in the 21st century. Not taking a side. I would not recommend, or I don't think Sri Lanka should, because geopolitical competition is good for a country like Sri Lanka. It opens up more opportunities for us to engage and make more out of it, because it's a great opportunity if you use it smartly. There will be a lot of pressure on us. We are already seeing the geopolitical pressure on Sri Lanka, but it's also the best time for engagement if you do it right, because a lot of small countries have thrived using geopolitical competition in a way. I mean, so managing it will be the challenge. For example, take Singapore.
George, on the subject of foreign policy, there's a common perception that a lot of China's investments are happening in what you call the global south, in South America, in Africa, in South Asia, of course in the South China Sea as well. Given this, and also taking into consideration the fact that under the previous administration, officials at the foreign ministry, the foreign minister himself, and even the president at times, had repeatedly spoken of shifting foreign policy to be more favorable with our partners at the time. We saw the opening of more embassies in Africa. In Uganda was a topic that came up constantly on the news. Do you think that model, or that foreign policy that was being targeted at the time, was feasible, that it was what the country needed, given growing Chinese influence in Sri Lanka?
To start off on a point that you made at the initiation of your intervention, you started talking about the fact that China is investing very heavily in the global south. That's because the global south needs investment. The global south is yearning for development. The global south is looking to countries around the world to attract investment, and there's tough competition to attract that investment. There was a time where the West was pouring in a lot of investment in terms of infrastructure development. That is not happening in the same manner as it was in the past. China has the capacity to do that. China is doing that in the world. In terms of whether you want to call what was being done a certain model that was being utilized, we've got to understand that Sri Lanka was reaching out to all countries across the board, especially in the global south, especially countries who have been very close to Sri Lanka in the non-aligned movement in the G77, in order to ensure that we had sufficient support in the United Nations. This was one of the most critical factors. So whether it stems from China's influence, or whether it stems from something within our own national interest, are two different things, I think, here. But this is where China has been able to, as you mentioned very rightly, invest extremely heavily in South America and become a larger investor in South America than the United States itself. And this is where we go back to 1959. Dwight Eisenhower at the time talks about the fact that America may be the mightiest and the most powerful country in the world, but America would need to do two very important things. And he talks about reaching out and helping the world neighborhood with freedom and with economic and social progression. Now, the freedom part, maybe we can argue, has happened to some extent in terms of replicating the models of democracy, whatever you want to call it, in certain parts of the world. But when it has come to economic progression, countries are yearning for economic progression. Our country is yearning for economic progression. No country is willing to step back and allow others to race ahead. Everybody wants to be in the forefront of economic development. And if it is such a situation in which this assistance is only coming from a country like China, countries have to reach out to China, and countries are reaching out to China. We've been doing that for a considerable period of time, irrespective of which government has been in power. We have worked very closely with the Chinese.
Given this sort of reality, because Harinder was saying earlier that we can't afford to be partisan in our foreign policy, but given that, as you quite correctly pointed out, it appears that for much of the global south, Sri Lanka included, investment can only be attracted, or investment that they need for economic progress is only available from China. Given such a reality, is it impossible to remain non-partisan in terms of foreign policy, and that our foreign policy will naturally continue to sway even more and more towards China?
No, it is certainly possible for us to remain on a more neutral stance there. Whilst we do receive assistance, while we do receive aid, grants, loans, etc. coming into the country, we've also got to understand certain dynamics within the region. We can't change our neighbors. I mean, countries, neighbors remain who they are. You've got to work with your neighbors. Your neighborhood becomes very important to you. Countries with which you have historical connections become very important to you. You have to keep working with them. It does not mean that you're going to choose one over the other. It's just that in our position as a small country, we've got to be extremely focused on the fact that national interest of Sri Lanka comes first here. Whether it be the loan that is coming from China, whether it be some kind of investment project coming in from India, whether it be assistance coming in from the United States, Japan, wherever it may be across the world, Sri Lanka needs as much as possible. We need to reach out, we need to work with. We cannot turn away, we cannot have varying degrees of responsiveness to certain countries. It has got to be a situation in which we've got to understand what is in our national interest. Obviously the Chinese know what is in their national interest and they are going ahead achieving it, and there's nothing wrong in that when you look at it from the bigger picture. This is where Sri Lanka needs to focus on what is in our interest.
Have we identified that in decades after independence? 7 decades after independence, have we identified what our national interests are?
We've seen that under various regimes from the time of D.S. Senanayake onwards, whether it was in the signing of the Rubberized Pact with the Chinese. I mean, it was quite clearly mentioned at that point that this was nothing but a commercial deal. We were not willing to engage politically with China at that point. We were not willing to engage with any country that embraced communism at that point. But yet, the situation warranted us. The national interest at the point was in order to secure the fact that our rubber was sold out and the rubber producers were not ruined in this country, and we had a steady flow of rice coming to the country. Whether it went on to our interactions thereafter with the Colombo Conference in 1954, which leads on to Bandung, and we focus on what is in the best interest of Sri Lanka, and we become a co-sponsor of Bandung in 55. Whether we become a founding member of the non-aligned movement, we continue from there up to through the 60s and the 70s in the non-aligned movement. But then it came to 1980s and there was a situation over Falkland Islands, and at that point we decided to side with the British, because within our national interest at the time, the Mahabali projects were much more important than a principled stance being followed at that point.
So given the historic timeline that you very sort of succinctly outlined there, it appears that Sri Lanka has never had a truly, as a state at least, has never had a truly non-aligned policy, and instead our foreign policy has just seesawed between which party was in government or which leaders were in government.
No country has been completely non-aligned, and this is where the non-aligned movement itself is so fluid. It's not titled the non-aligned association, the non-aligned organization, the non-aligned union. It's a non-aligned movement, and this is where fluidity comes in. Some of the biggest countries in the world which have been pillars of the non-aligned movement have swayed. Non-alignment is at the end of the day a grouping. It has become today today of course we talk about non-aligned movement not being as effective as it was, but I can tell you that to date the non-aligned connectivity that remains is still very relevant. Countries of the global south still look after the countries of the global south. We look out for each other. We try to help each other, and this is where in that bigger picture of understanding what exactly is going on from a foreign policy perspective, countries are always wanting to ensure that their national interest is safeguarded. We may have international affiliations. We come first.
Subhashini, there was mention earlier of the express train of Chinese development. Is this still a reality? Because there are concerns regarding the rate of growth of China, and as Harinda mentioned earlier, if China is to keep continuing at this rate, it will need the energy and the resources to keep flowing in. Is the express train of Chinese development still, does that concept still hold true, or is the train slowing down?
No, I think that concept definitely holds true, and that is why China's rise is really an opportunity as well as a challenge for not just Sri Lanka, for the entire world. And Sri Lanka is already reaping many benefits of China's express train. For example, China today is one of the largest sources of tourists in the world. And as a result, Sri Lanka has been really targeting the Chinese market, and today China is the second largest source of tourists into Sri Lanka, and they are most likely to overtake India as well. And within just a very short period of about less than 5 years, Chinese tourists have increased from something like 50,000 to over 250,000. So another reason is that a lot of us feel that investments from China or loans from China is also due to Chinese growth and Chinese accumulation of foreign reserves that enables China to have deep pockets that to lend out to other countries. And China as a market, so today Sri Lanka, 20% of imports into Sri Lanka comes from China, and Chinese share of imports used to be far lower compared to before. India used to be our leading source of imports. And here itself you can see the geopolitical you're talking about, just looking at Sri Lanka, how China is actually tapping into Sri Lankan economy, which once was dominated by India. So you can see it's not just political and security tensions, but also there is this economic tensions as well that is playing a role. But definitely countries like Sri Lanka stands to benefit from rise of China and huge market potential and the capital China has.
Subhashini, on the subject of economics, now we've already seen Sri Lanka maybe make, according to some, positive, according to others ill-advised deals with the Chinese in terms of the port, the airport, the Colombo South port, etc. There is now talk of a free trade agreement with China as well, which the current administration is pursuing. Given the history of our dealings with China, how should we be approaching this?
So I think actually the free trade agreement with China was initiated by the previous government, and it has been basically continued by the current government. So what we really need to understand is whether it's large project investments into like the bad deals we are talking about, is it China or is it Sri Lankan government and our bureaucracy negotiating bad deals with everybody? Right. So there is a lot of criticism about Indian Railway, the railway constructed by India, saying that it's very costly. So, and it's not just even with foreign parties, even our own tenders, our own projects. There is a lot of corruption, lot of not following due process, very little accountability, very little consequence of people who violate the laws or disregard the process. So I think it's not just China, it is a systemic issue in Sri Lanka. It's a problem that the country has with our institutions, systems, bureaucracy, which obviously any party can benefit from when they are negotiating with Sri Lanka. So, and Sri Lanka will be at a losing end because of these systemic weaknesses and issues we are faced with.
So your contention is basically that as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, it's not a matter of China becoming too powerful or India becoming too powerful or there being too much Western influence. It's simply the absence of a rule-based system where a state can negotiate.
So the power politics, like geopolitics and the tensions between powerful nations, definitely is a continuing trend, and Sri Lanka will have impact of these trends. But lack of a proper regulatory and institutional system and good checks and balances definitely exposes you and makes a country more vulnerable as opposed to a country that has better systems.
Right. Thank you very much,
Sonali,
Subhashini.
can I squeeze in just one question?
Sure.
Subhashini, now we know that it's favorable for small economies to get loans from China because of less conditions that they impose as compared to credit from other agencies from the West, basically. So looking back, now for example, countries like Sri Lanka has got into a debt trap, right? Looking back, do you think the government had a better option of sorting out Hambantota and Mattala?
So first of all, I also want to know, I have reservations about these conditional loans and non-conditional loans. It's all about what the conditions are. If somebody is insisting that this should be an international competitive bidding process, I would welcome that condition. If somebody insists that there has to be a proper environment impact assessment and we are not going to do a project without very sound proper environment assessment and we are not going to fund you, I would welcome that, even if the projects get delayed. If somebody is saying we need to do a good assessment of feasibility, returns and commercial viability and we are not funding it, I would welcome those conditions. Actually not having those conditions, especially when you are dealing with a government and a bureaucracy without any proper systems, rules and regulations, and definitely has significant degree of corruption, actually to me somebody putting those conditions is good for the country. So that is an area where I would deviate. It's all about what are the conditions, right? There can be a lot of positive conditions. So repeat the next question. Repeat the question that you actually...
I was wondering, in your opinion, do you think the government would have dealt with the situation in a, say, another solution perhaps without, handing over operations of key infrastructure facilities to China and India?
This idea of handing over operations to us, like I think especially in these port operations and port management, being given to private parties or others is becoming a common trend, right? So earlier even Sri Lanka used to manage all the terminals in Colombo port. But today, terminals being managed by private entities is considered a healthy development, and therefore it's not just the party. It's not this thing. It is much more about the commercial viability of the project and the returns to the country. So who is managing the project is less important as opposed to how much benefits does the project brings to the country. So I think there has not been enough discussion around how can Hambantota port and its development, regardless of whether it's being managed by Chinese or any other party, how is it going to benefit Sri Lanka? I think that is the conversation I do not hear here, and which I feel people should be focusing more on rather than ownership of the place per se, which is more a concern of the West than Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much. We go in for a short commercial break where you're with Face the Nation. We're discussing China's role in the Indian Ocean, the opportunities and challenges faced by Sri Lanka. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We're discussing China's role in the Indian Ocean. What are the opportunities to Sri Lanka? What are the challenges to Sri Lanka? My first question in this round is to Dr. Harinda Vidanage, Director at BCIS. Dr. Vidanage, we oftentimes speak of Sri Lanka's strategic geopolitical location and situation. How equipped is Sri Lanka to manage its seduction by China on the one hand, by India on the other hand, bearing in mind that both those countries are rivals, and how is Sri Lanka equipped to safeguard its own national interests in this backdrop?
Okay, so yeah, the strategic location is both a blessing and a curse, because it has and the fact that there's a fundamental problem when it comes to Sri Lankan policymakers as well, because the idea that because we are strategically located, we are endowed with so many things. But I think that's a bit of a misconception as well, and there's a misconception in this whole idea of national interest. I'll come there. Yes, Sri Lanka, we have always been, historically, strategic location has been important for us. That's what has made this country. I mean, we were a hub before we realized it. That is how it was nurtured. So many waves of people, migrants, colonizers. But coming to the current context, as I said earlier, it's becoming so important because of the intense geopolitical rivalry. right? Which is not just located within the Indian Ocean; it's located across. So if you're looking at China, China's focus is not the Indian Ocean. It's per se. If you look at China's One Belt One Road, it's an Afro-Eurasian grand strategy. I mean, it's about connecting the dots. So we are just one node in that, right? But we are a very important node in that because, as George pointed out, because of our neighbor. You know that this we call it, you know, fatalism, determinism. We have a neighbor which is significantly powerful in the region. So of course that is the challenge. I mean, that is going to be a reality moving on. I mean, the fact that we are going to face significant geopolitical turbulence, but managing that would also be it's based on the success of how we do it. Can you ask me can you kind of go back to the second part of the question? I mean, yeah.
Sure. Do you think Sri Lanka is well equipped to safeguard its national interests?
That's where I think you know, we really need to revisit what both these speakers also about our institutions. Political will, the institutions. I mean, these are the primary lines of defense, as well as you know, and our education systems. You know, we need smart, intelligent policymakers, diplomats. We need people who can, you know, as Sudarshan said, who can go and negotiate. We have a big problem with negotiation. We don't have people who understand the nuances of how others, you know, come to the negotiation table when it comes to things like free trade agreements. So I think we have a serious crisis of institutions, professionalism, education. When we are, I mean, that's why I'm saying we are all saying we are in a geopolitically strategic location. But if we don't have we are not equipped enough to either to face the challenge and reap the benefits. Either way, we are in for a rough ride in the future, which is a sad thing to say at this point, but that's the reality. From my I mean, it's my personal opinion. That's what I feel.
Thank you very much. George, my next question is to you. You are an ex-diplomat. You were in the Foreign Service, and at the risk of sounding politically incorrect, I must ask you this. When it comes to bilateral relations, dealing with world leaders requires a lot of diplomacy, a lot of understanding of the various nuances associated with it. However, something that we find is that in our present setup, sometimes the people, the representatives that we send for these negotiations don't possess these skills. So how do we grapple with this issue? I think Dr. Vidanage also drew reference to this. How do we grapple with the issue of not having qualified enough policymakers and representatives to represent our country's interests?
This is where we probably got to begin with redefining the role of the diplomat. We go back to the pre-Cold War period. Diplomats were extremely essential. They were the go-between between leaders. They dealt with the two leaders. The leaders did not meet per se. They did not travel much. There were issues with regard to transportation, etc. The main focus was on the diplomat. Today we are in an era in which summit diplomacy has become a part and parcel of international relations. Leaders are meeting all the time. They are meeting on the sidelines of the UNGA, they are meeting on the sidelines of regional groupings, they are meeting even at state funerals, which has also become a key position from which they could assess new leaders and also the existing ones. But what we've got to understand is the role of the diplomat has evolved to a position in which the diplomat today is an analyst. The diplomat today is not a generalist anymore. You have to become a specialist. You have to look at particular areas. Countries are focusing on that. Certain countries deploy diplomats in particular regions to specialize in geopolitical situations within that particular region. They're looking at how they can enhance diplomats. They're looking at career development. This enhancement aspect has become so very critical. You see, when it comes to the area of foreign policy, we are grappling with so many issues at the same time. Everyone is not physically equipped to deal with every issue under the sun that is going to arise on a weekly basis. This is where you need to have the specialization component coming in, being fed into foreign policy.
Sure.
So while it's important for foreign policy formulation, it is also very critical for the implementation component to have this diversity.
So what are your recommendations to rectify this situation, George?
What we need to do is look at one of the most necessary areas, and that is coming from a research institution focusing on the aspect of research. This has got to be done to a much greater degree than what we are doing at the moment. Other countries are extremely familiar, as we are talking about China. Many in, for example, the Chinese Foreign Ministry would be very clear and would know at once who signed the Rubber Ice Pact on behalf of Sri Lanka back in 1952. A lot of people on this side of the divide do not know who signed the Rubber Ice Pact on behalf of Ceylon at the time. This is where countries are using history. I mean, recently a headline talked about the fact that Xi Jinping is not making history, history is making Xi Jinping. This is where the relevance of history, understanding where we have been, to understanding what we are doing today and where we are going forward into the future. What is our next step going to be? For that, we need to be extremely clear what has been. History repeats itself, of course, in various forms and manifestations, but there are tendencies. We need to be alert, we need to be ready, we need to be prepared and equipped at that point.
George Cook, thank you very much for sharing your perspectives. My final question is to Subhashini Abe Singha, Research Director at Verite Research. When it comes to the situation with China, we find that Sri Lanka is taking short-term loans and China's over-eagerness to offer these loans. Then on the other hand, we have this concept of debt management and public service management. Is Sri Lanka's government able to grapple with these concepts, or are we just just acting out of free will without any consideration for the greater implications that all of this loan taking entails?
So I think one of the things that Sri Lanka needs to really understand in terms of its public finance management and debt management is this shift from us having access to concessional loans to us not having access to concessional loans. So when you had access to concessional loans at very long with very long-term concessional loans, the governments could relax and they had sufficient room to maneuver. But when you're a country that is no longer eligible for that kind of loans, you are inevitably reaching out to other financial markets or other lenders who will give you funds at commercial rates and generally at short term, right? So that means your public finance management structures, the professionalism and the quality of management becomes all the more important than before. I think this is especially when you are more than China. Actually, when you talk about debt management, one of the biggest problems that Sri Lanka faces actually not the exposure to China, but exposure to international financial markets through various international sovereign bonds we have issued. And international financial markets are a lot less forgiving to countries who are unable to pay than actually bilateral or multilateral donors. So as Sri Lanka exposes itself to these international financial markets, I think that is a factor we need to really take into consideration. And another problem Sri Lanka has is not the debt size of the debt per se, but our capacity to pay debt, which depends entirely on our earnings. So Sri Lanka is a lower middle income country with one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios. And Sri Lanka, that is basically the revenue government earns, part of which will go for debt servicing. So when your revenue is very low, when your revenue can't even meet your recurrent expenditure or day-to-day expenditure, then it's very difficult for a country to grow. And then you have the other ways for your foreign debt, you must have foreign exchange earnings. What are Sri Lanka's sources of foreign exchange earnings? Sri Lanka has again one of the lowest exposed to GDP ratios among all middle income countries. And we are foreign direct investments for decades. We thought it was because of war we did not get foreign direct investments, but war has been over and it's almost 8 years, but we are still not getting the foreign direct investments we should be getting. And we are still solely depending a lot on worker remittances to basically cushion this. So I think generating earnings to pay back loans is a critical area the government need to focus on.
Subhashini, sometimes it's a tendency of a superpower to use exploitative tactics, especially because it has the higher bargaining power and it's negotiating with a poorer country. So how does Sri Lanka go about protecting itself from these exploitative tactics?
So one of the problems that I see Sri Lanka has is we should, if you take port infrastructure, even Colombo port, or the opportunities Sri Lanka has, for example, we often talk about this Sri Lanka's strategic location being the reason why all these countries are interested in Sri Lanka. What is ironically is all these countries see how important the strategic location is and what benefits they can gain from it. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka, sitting at this strategic location, has been unable to benefit from it. If you especially look at countries like places like Dubai, Singapore, Rotterdam, Panama, Chile, all these places which are really in strategic locations and how they have become hubs into the region and thrived economically and benefited hugely from their strategic locations by being gateways to larger regions for other countries. But unfortunately, Sri Lanka sits on this location and basically other countries see huge benefits they can gain, but we are really not reaping the benefits of this location. And this is extremely unfortunate. A very good example is, for example, the East Container Terminal in Colombo Port that is sitting idle at the moment. And our politicians, our political parties keep on debating about who should do this East Container Terminal. Is it the Ports Authority? Is it the government? Should it be give it to India? There are plenty of people who are interested in investing in this, not loans. We don't have to take loans. There are plenty of private investors who are really keen to invest in this East Container Terminal. And if you speak to anyone in the maritime and logistics industry, they all strongly feel this is something that really needs urgent attention and we need to make this container terminal work. But unfortunately, within our political structures, this has basically nobody is acting upon it, and we keep on debating and discussing while other regions, including India, other regional countries, other regional competitors is increasingly investing in improving their port capacities and their connectivity. And we are taking this hub status for granted, but I don't think we can be too complacent about that this hub status for us is a given thing, that it is going to last forever. So I think while we do agree of the interest that others have, I think we should put greater focus on why are we wasting this biggest asset we have, which is our geographical location.
Thank you, Subhashini. Dr. Vidanage, if Sri Lanka is blind to its own positive strategic location, and if other countries around it can see it and use this, where is Sri Lanka going wrong in not identifying this strength? Do you blame the policymakers, or is it the education system? If we are to correct this, if we are to disseminate the right information about this, if we are to alert everyone, all the stakeholders, how do we go about doing it?
I mean, it's a very complex question, but let's try to break it down. What's going wrong is there is an array of issues. So one is that, as we all agree, I think here across the board, is the fact that we are not using this status as a hub to benefit. I mean, why? I mean, why? How is Dubai succeeding? How is Singapore succeeding? So there you have, I think what we have not realized is we have become very subject to taking the international pressure. I think our political leadership, not just the current one or the past one, for a long time, I think we have become prisoners of the greater powers, which is a sad thing. But if you look at things even now, a lot of things Sri Lankans think are local are actually not local. They are results of significant geopolitical pressure. I think our political elite has consistently succumbed to this pressure, right? That's one thing. The reason being, I think we have not devised or being smart enough to engage with these things for a long time. We have not managed to create spaces for ourselves. And of course we have had issues. For example, we went through a 30-year war, which actually had a significant geopolitical bearing, and we have succumbed to that. So that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem is our political processes have become so partisan, and the message that has gone to the public is also very partisan, right? There is no way we can convince. I mean, if you take the idea of a free trade agreement, idea of, say, the idea what she brought out about a particular asset we have, are we going to have investors on it? The moment we have that conversation, it becomes a significantly partisan, ideologically partisan political debate, which is stalling the whole process, right? We don't have the people who can tell the public, right, this is what we are going to achieve, this is what we are not going to achieve. That message is not going out. If you look at all the political debates we are having even now, nobody is bold enough to tell the truth. They are always partisan to a political ideology, which is very sad, right? Which is not what we expect from policymakers. There has to be that boldness is not there. So that and so I'm saying it's a progression of it's a kind of a cancer in a way. It's metastasizing at all levels. So that's the problem. But I think as representing education institution and a research institution which does this, looks at international affairs, I think one place is education. We need a public which is more aware, more not as objective as they are at the moment, right? Which has a critical understanding, but that public is also need to be backed by professional and educational services that can create professionals, policymakers who can get this message across. If not, we are going to succumb more in the coming very recent future. We have already gone there. So I mean, we have to accept that we are actually. So people are saying, can we manage India or China? I'm saying we have passed that. We are past balancing India and China. We are past balancing India or China. So I'll leave it there. I think we can have a conversation.
George,
I'm sure we can have a conversation.
Towards the end of the first round, Subhashini sort of highlighted and underscored the fact that, look, one of the key problems that Sri Lanka has, especially with identifying what our national interest is in the first place, is the absence of a proper rules-based system. Do you think this is true as far as our foreign policy and our negotiating power is concerned?
Definitely. One thing that we've got to be extremely clear about, and in response to Sonali's question earlier, I was talking about the role of the diplomat, and that is in terms of implementation. You also have the formulation aspect of foreign policy, and this is where informed decisions have to be made. We cannot be making decisions on an ad hoc basis depending on a development on a particular day. We need to have a strategy. We need to be strategizing for the future. We need to be looking at, as Dr. Vidanage said, as China is looking at the 5 years, but 35 years, we should be having at least a 10-year plan as to where we want to be. What are the gateways into the world that we want to open up? Who are the countries that we want to identify as key strategic partners out there? What are the regional groupings? What are the particular regions that would afford us key benefits in times to come, in given some of the latest trends in the world? However, amongst, while there's a large to-do list or a wish list virtually that exists, one of the critical problems that we continue to face is the fact that we are generally ill-prepared. We are ill-prepared when it comes to negotiation. We are ill-prepared when it comes to, you can even argue, policy formulation. Simply because we are not going in there with a targeted approach. This Sri Lanka first concept, this whole identification of the country coming first, benefiting the country. Dr. Vidanage talked about partisan politics, which is very much dominating governance in so many sectors. A continuous problem that we are facing is our poor preparation. And this remains one of the most critical problems that we are facing.
In the recent past though, would you say it's party politics or individual sort of agendas that have really driven such decision making?
So this is where, when it comes to foreign policy formulation, it lies within a very limited remit of people. When it comes to the actual formulation of policy, you have the president, you have the prime minister, you have the minister, you may have key ministers in the cabinet also who are involved in the entire process. But this is not the first time we've had such a situation. We go back to the late 1970s. President Jayawardena not only was involved in foreign policy and appointed our first non-prime ministerial foreign minister in A.C.S. Hamid, Prime Minister Premadasa was involved, Lalita Atulathmudali was involved, Gamin Disanayaka, Ronnie Dimel. We had several key stakeholders who were involved, very strong personalities, you might add, when you look at that particular era. But they all had a specific task. There was specific direction into what was to be achieved. There were clear targets that had been set out. Some may argue they were achieved, some may argue they were not. But at the end of the day, we had a clear notion of what we wanted to get out of that particular first regime, the first administration of President Jayawardena, for example. We can go back to the times of Mrs. Bandaranaike. You look at some of the key people who were involved around her, whether it was Felix Dias Bandaranaike, whether it was some of the key diplomats like Dr. Vernon Mendes, some of the key people who were working around the clock in terms of formulating policy for this country. We had clear targets of where we wanted to go and what we wanted to achieve. This country has sat on the Security Council of the United Nations, and that's back in 1960, just 5 years after we joined the UN. We are at the 60th anniversary, we've gone past 60th anniversary. We are not even attempting to join the Security Council, contest for a seat on the Security Council. We've chaired the General Assembly. What has happened? This was back in 1976. It's not that Sri Lanka is a small country, a country that is incapable of achieving large, punching above our weight. We can do it. We have done it. We should be doing it.
George,
having been in the sort of the foreign service and then sort of now as an educator on international relations, where do you think we've gone wrong in identifying our foreign policy priorities? And is this, for example, I've been in interviews with former diplomats where they've said that the absence of, we need to have a white paper on foreign policy in Parliament and we need to really hash things out. Is that the solution? How do you really, how do we get Sri Lanka, how do we as a country identify what our priorities are when it comes to our foreign policy?
We need to all be singing off the same sheet. This is where we need to have a coherent policy in terms of, and I mentioned this word strategy again, it has to be a pragmatic strategy of understanding what is in the best interest of the country. Whether it be a meeting of several rounds of meetings between key policymakers in this country, including the President, Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, who are going to meet over a couple of weeks and identify what are going to be our policies, whether it's going to be a consultative process as you mentioned in terms of including Parliament, key political parties in this country, where this country is supposed to go. That needs to be done. We need to have a strategy. We need to know what we want to achieve. Because otherwise at the end of the day we seem to be relying on rather obscure identification of a certain visit coming up once in a way, people coming to the country, us going into other countries. Every visit that we undertake must be for a purpose. Every visitor that we invite to this country must be for a purpose. We need to have that, we need to be gearing ourselves to achieve that target. That should be our focus.
George, you mentioned about being ill-prepared, and Dr. Vidanage said he talked about the importance of research. Right now, Sri Lanka has several think tanks, institutions like BCIS, Lakshman Kadrigam Institute, Verite Research. But do policymakers actually listen? Do they consider the input coming from these organizations?
Well, at the end of the day, policy think tanks, research bodies, are playing a very pivotal role in society. As key elements of civil society, they are contributing towards providing ideas, providing rationale for policy formulation. At that point, policy formulators have to take note of what is being done. To some degree, it is being taken note. To some degree, there is a certain varied involvement of some of the institutions that you mentioned with the state, with foreign policy formulation, and with policy formulation across the board. But what happens is, you need to come to this situation in which you need to realize that you do not know everything. Merely sitting in particular positions of power does not entrust you or does not provide you with an all-knowing, all-encompassing area of wisdom. It does not happen in academia either. Academics are not all-knowing either. You need to have this bridge, you need to have this collaboration taking place, where the state has got to look at private think tanks, look at bodies, look at organizations, and look at building a bridge, provide opportunities. Because it's understandable on a daily basis when it comes to, for example, foreign policy formulators and foreign policy implementers, you have a whole gamut of issues on a daily basis. You need to have thinkers coming on board and providing you with some kind of direction, some kind of awareness, providing you with some kind of knowledge that maybe is not within your remit, and which you would do better, you would be able to make better informed decisions if you had that information. So this is where there's a strong argument for much closer interaction between academia and policymakers.
Subhashini, just a minute, Nandi. Now, for Sri Lanka to really benefit out of the China One Belt One Road initiative, we are part of it. What are the domestic mechanisms that need to be ready? You always talk about barriers within our own borders in terms of exports. How should we approach doing our homework and be prepared for OBOR?
So One Belt One Road initiative partly is useful one as a source of funding for the country, obviously, and the second is the connectivity it creates within the region. So especially Asian region, and even if we take South Asia, we always say this is one of the least integrated regions in the world, and one of the biggest problems is connectivity. So basically taking goods from one Asian country, from Sri Lanka to Asia, is a lot more costlier than taking goods to Europe or to USA, because the connectivity, and regions like Europe is very basically they are far more integrated because of air connectivity, rail connectivity, transport connectivity. So that if you take this region, even if we want to fly to Dhaka, we have to go to Middle East, some destination, and transit via. We don't have direct flights. So this is basically one of the major advantages that One Belt One Road brings, is hopefully that it will improve this connectivity through better infrastructure. But Sri Lanka on one hand is, so this connectivity means there will be far more trade flows that is happening, taking place within Asia. And this is where Sri Lanka has the greatest strength as a facilitator of these trade flows, being a basically what we call basically a lip service that every government gives to being this regional maritime logistics hub. So one of the biggest advantages we have during the last so many years is actually, to some extent, we've been able to bridge the infrastructure gap. Like the other two speakers said, because of 3 decades of war, we have really not invested in infrastructure to the extent at the time Sri Lanka basically gained peace. We had our port and airport running at their maximum. Basically, Sri Lanka, the Colombo port could not handle any more cargo than they were doing, and Colombo airport could not handle any more passengers than they were handling. They were actually doing beyond their capacity. So one of the things that we've done, and we are already doing, which is really good, is investing in building infrastructure and building capacity. And that is where we should actually continue to do that, like International Container Terminal and other terminals, as well as the phase 2 of Bandaranaike Airport. So but infrastructure alone is not sufficient to create an efficient, attractive international logistics and maritime hub. it requires much better procedures, processes, technology, efficient regulations. It is all about how fast can you turn around cargo, how much can you value add, and how much, at what cost and at what speed can you give a service to these international clients who want to use your location as a logistics hub. And we are competing with people who have been far ahead of us, like Singapore. I mean, so your competitors are far better equipped and has far better capacity than you do, and we have a lot of catching up to do. But the area where we have really failed is actually using technology, improving our regulations, creating much more transparent, accountable procedures and processes. And if we do that, to complement the infrastructure, there is huge potential for Sri Lanka to become a gateway to Indian subcontinent.
Should we, when we undertake such reforms, should it be should it be geared towards the Belt and Road Initiative, or should we be undertaking such reforms because we need such reforms?
I mean, to me, this idea of becoming the potential Sri Lanka has to become a logistics hub has nothing to do with One Belt, One Road. It is a potential that we already had. Of course, the security and the board definitely did undermine our potential, but we have not really been able to thrive even after 2010. So immaterial. I mean, Singapore did not wait for a One Belt, One Road to think that this strategic location is the asset we have, and we need to work on it, and that is how they became a...
The reason that I ask that is, we know that China's economic system is different to much of the world. It's planned by the Communist Party, and the vision is laid out. Whether it's the Communist Party or Xi Jinping, at present that happens from period to period. And not all of China's grand ambitious ventures have been successful. The immediate one that springs to mind is Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward, which was disastrous for the Chinese people. Do you think that China has the muscle and the resources to pull off this grand vision, the Belt and Road Initiative?
So that's a very, very tough question. But what you really do understand is China has achieved tremendous progress within a very short period, and that has to be, really recognized and appreciated. The fact that China's rise is making everybody uncomfortable, like you said, one reason is because it is operating on a different model to the existing power structures, right? And the second is its sheer size overwhelms everybody. It's a massive economy, right? So it is challenging. Definitely, the One Belt, One Road initiative has 60 plus countries, and people estimate it will cost about over $1 trillion of investments, and like you said, some of the massive projects, like even the Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a $60 billion venture, which China wants to basically open connectivity with Central Asia, is a project that has huge risks. So this is definitely a warning that many analysts give to China, that it could also strain its own financial situation back home if many of these projects fail. And maybe that is one of the reasons why China, to safeguard its own interests, also are going for this debt to equity swaps, where the countries are increasingly, the countries they are lending to are not able to service the debts. And as a lender, that is, you're facing increasing risk working with these countries. So it's a very fine balance for China to manage its strategic geopolitical interests with economic realities. So how deep your pocket is, how much capacity you have to basically further your geopolitical and global strategy, and how much of economic costs or can you bear to push this strategy is definitely a challenge for China.
Harinder, it seems that the world is sort of transitioning from, correct me if I'm wrong, from the Cold War sort of bipolar two superpowers to the immediate aftermath where you had the US as the single reigning superpower to now an almost multipolar world in terms of international relations and global geopolitics, with the rise of China, the power of India, which is also growing in the region, then with Russia, or resurgent Russia under Vladimir Putin, and the US is also still a power player, very much a power player, and very much still the superpower in terms of military and economic might as well. In this sort of world with so many different players, it's probably not prudent to talk about China without talking about the rest as well, who have their own agendas and their own plans and visions and ambitions. Given this complex arena of international relations, I asked Subhashini whether it was economically feasible. I'll ask you whether the Belt and Road Initiative is politically feasible.
Yeah, I think, let me answer it like this. See, the Belt and Road Initiative, I don't think, I mean, we're all excited about it because of these large numbers and the infrastructure projects that we're talking about and the large number of countries it involves. But if you read between the lines, and if you, for example, what President Xi said at the 90th Congress about how China, what is China's future plans, their plan, I mean, we say China is a rising power. We like look at China as if in the next 5 years it's going to be it's dominating the world. But China's strategy and the strategic map, the argument is what they are saying is by 2035 China expects to be a moderately developed power, a moderately developed country. That's the objective. So and from 2035 till 2049, which they are saying that in 2049 would be 100 years anniversary of the Chinese Revolution, they expect China to be a really developed country. So we need to understand what China also wants, at least from their policy perspectives. So Belt and the Road Initiative, I think, is not about the next 5 years. They're looking at 2049, right? But your question is very valid, because will that be sustainable in this geopolitically intense competition? That's a big challenge, because the United States may at the moment be having what we call a very incoherent strategy when it comes to global politics, but it's not going to give up the status quo of the global leader, and it's not going to go down. I mean, it's not going to go like that. I mean, it's still the world's largest power. Economically, it's in a bit of a position. If you look at the last 15 years, it has spent $14 trillion on 30 wars, right? And the One Belt, One Road, what they're saying is they're looking at maximum $3 trillion, and China has not raised that. China, even the AIB, the whole institutional structure of One Belt, One Road is about $400 million that they're trying to put in. But I don't think they are very near enough for the 1 trillion or the 3 trillion they're looking at. But what they are providing, what the political message China is trying to give, is to show by doing things like One Belt, One Road that in the coming future, as you said, when everything is in a big mess, it's the only responsible country that could lead in global governance. I think that's the question, which Sonali started about the Davos. What the speech Xi Jinping gave at Davos would be a speech that would make sense in the next 20 years later. Because what he was trying to say was, because when the rest of the world is rejecting the same things like globalization, you have America first, you have a withering EU, you have a NATO in crisis, right? American leadership is not it's challenged. It's not gone, it's challenged. So what China is trying to show in the next 20 years is when that vacuum comes up, right, it also can be a responsible player by creating an alternate governance structure which they say is more inclusive than the system that is on now, which is led by the West, led by Western interests. What China is trying to say is we are trying to create an alternative that is owned by everybody, made in China, but not led by China.
Subhashini, just one quick question for Subhashini before we wrap up. We see now in this sort of multi-party global relations system that we're entering into, let's say, there are trade wars brewing, especially with the phenomenon of Donald Trump in the United States and his stance towards China. Where do you see this ending? How will this sort of contest between the American eagle and the Chinese dragon affect Sri Lanka?
Yeah, just before that, I would like to add one point to what Harinder said. I think he made a very valid point about what we need to understand is when we say China is the world's second largest economy, is the massive difference in levels of development that China and USA has. Simply to take the per capita income, you're talking about United States with a per capita income of over $50,000 US, with China, like Harinder said, is a developing country with just $8,000 US of per capita income, with still high levels of poverty. There is huge room for development. So definitely the One Belt, One Road initiative need to deliver something at home as well. Even within a different political model, if they fail to deliver to the people, then it is not going to be sustainable in the long term, which is again a challenge that China definitely faces. So in terms of the global trade wars that are really taking place, there can be both, because Sri Lanka is such a small player in the international trade. And we have actually shrunk our share in world trade over the years. Our world trade share in the world is less than what it used to be at the time of independence of the country. So Sri Lanka has actually less integrated in the world over the years, which means what is happening in the trade, international trade discourse does not really hugely affect Sri Lanka. But there can also be benefits. For example, in a recent discussion with some international businesses, there were these concerns about when United States is putting restrictions on China, there are investors who are feeling, should I diversify my investment destinations? So there are investors who are looking. China anyway has been seeing an outflow of investments due to cost and other factors, but what these US interventions can do is they can even accelerate these outflows from China into other countries, because people want to diversify their risks and reduce their risks. So there can be potential opportunities for countries in Asia as well when investors feel a little bit uncomfortable being over-reliant on China. So most of these global power play can be both an opportunity and a challenge for Sri Lanka. Small countries like Sri Lanka, it's all about how smart are we to mitigate the risks and exploit the opportunities.
Dr. Vidanage, now as the geopolitical competition intensifies in the Indian Ocean, do you think Sri Lanka can play a role to push for rule-based conduct in the Indian Ocean? Can we initiate that process?
I'll respond to that, because before I forget, I want to tell you something. You asked us earlier, George, about what the policymakers are getting from think tanks or education institutions like us, all of us. But I think as a media, you could do a survey among policymakers if they know what a think tank is, one, if they know what they do, two, if they know that this kind of research wealth is there, and why haven't they have done it? I mean, that would be really helpful for the country. Because there are so much, there are so much smart people, researchers doing so much of hard work. It's just that, as George pointed out, there is a major yawning gap between that. We have not bridged that. So I think as a responsible media, that's something you really can do. Two, okay, I'll come back to your question about what we can gain Or are we, sorry, can you repeat the question? Just
Yeah, whether Sri Lanka can push for a rule-based, conduct in the Indian Ocean.
I'm a little, the idea of a rule-based order is a very much of a Western liberal construct, right? The idea that that's where it came from, the idea since Bretton Woods, since the end of the Second World War. So I think what we should have is to push for a set of, I think, rules-based, Sri Lanka pushing for a rule-based order when we even can't regulate and have a coherent set of strategies. We don't have foreign policy, we don't have strategy on, we're a country that is so weak in trying to create our own set of rules, trying to propagate a set of rules. Idea of a rules-based order is a little bit of I'm miffed by the idea, but Sri Lanka has always been a key pivot in bringing out ideas like non-alignment. So I'm not trying to devalue it. I think what we should push for is a norms, the idea of bringing back a set of norms that rules can be made on, because I think going back to what Nadeem said about this whole, we are living in a significantly strategic flux, the world, and there are the ideas of governance there are a lot of competing views. Even the US and India doesn't have equal views on global governance. So in that context, when Sri Lanka is trying to say, hey, let's have a rule I'm pushing for it, that's a bit not pragmatic. But the pragmatic thing is Sri Lanka trying to create a forum or a space where we can talk about future of norms of global governance, or even how we navigate, for example, competitive waters like the Indian Ocean. That's a more pragmatic thing. I mean, before you should have the rules are all based on norms. We are forgetting the norms, we are kind of rushing towards the rules. So I think we should revisit the norms of the 21st century Indian Ocean. How are we going to, because militarization is going to be a fact, competition is going to be a fact, geopolitics is going to be a fact. So what is the point of trying to pretend as if these things are not happening and trying to say, hey, let's have a rules-based order? I think there is a bit of a disconnect. The intentions, I don't think it's not, I don't think it's anything negative. I think it's well-meaning. I think it's misplaced.
So going by China's behavior in the South China Sea, who could sort of avoid that happening in the Indian Ocean? Who should take the initiative?
South China Sea is a very contentious, again, China asserting itself in South China Sea, I don't think is a violation of because that's a bit of a complex. I don't know that this is the forum to discuss that, but China's role in South and North China Sea, I think that point of is again a bit of a Western perspective of China's role there. I think we should take a different, there are a lot of nuances there about how China, because if you are an emerging power like China, if you have a very complex neighborhood, China is bordering 16 countries, right? So, and China is rising, and China has significantly, historic, there are neighbors from Japan to Vietnam, to Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia. So if you're trying to talk about China's conduct in that, I think we need to, because it's a strategic competition there, right? So we can't take a moral high ground saying China is doing something really bad in that neighborhood and looking at the international relations from that perspective. I mean, that's how we are trained and taught, and the whole discipline of IR, which is a very Eurocentric discipline, is making us focus on. So I'll stop it there. I don't think that's very much, but I think that's something we should be very careful about when we try to look at a country's conduct from a Eurocentric perspective. So that's a particular lens we are looking at China. I don't know if that's the right.
You say the Eurocentric and the ASEAN-centric perspectives are the same?
Well, I mean, these are all constructs, right? That's what I'm saying. What ASEAN now, for example, everybody's saying, look at Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore, how they interact with China and the US and India. But I don't think they are driven by the same set of perspectives that, for example, India has about China or the US has about China. I think it's a more nuanced and a more complicated, and they are very. I think Indonesia's foreign policy is something we should study.
So
Sri Lanka,
what is the approach that Singapore has taken? You know, how did they manage?
Singapore is a key pivot point in the One Belt One Road. It's one of the largest. It has significant American presence. There is it's security. See, this is I think Sri Lanka got it wrong. Our economic diplomacy and our security diplomacy can be two different things. Right? We don't have to tie everything with our economic diplomacy, and there is always where nuances we can do. This is why Sri Lanka needs extremely complex, smart foreign policy making. We don't have to worry about everything. We don't have to put everything in the same basket. It's not as black and white as that. So how Singapore manages is a great case study for us in the future. How Indonesia manages is a great case study. I mean, these countries are managing. I mean, they face more strategic pressure. There is more American, Australian presence in that part of the world than in Sri Lanka, around Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Vidanage. With that, we go in for our final commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the final round of this edition of Face the Nation. My final question for tonight is to Subhashini Abhisinghe, Research Director at Verite Research. How do we put in an effective system of checks and balances in Sri Lanka to ensure that our dealings with foreign parties is properly regulated?
Actually, I think I can start that question from where Harinda ended, because this idea about economic diplomacy and security and political diplomacy or relationships, economic relationships, I totally agree with what Harinda said. Sri Lanka's one biggest failure is our inability to separate these. Now, you were talking about South China Sea being a very contentious hotspot with a lot of political disputes or border land disputes with China. But what you would see is East Asian economies are far more economically integrated with China than any other region in the world. And also South Korea and China entered into a free trade agreement despite their political and security concerns and suspicions, because South Korea as a trading nation knows if they are not in the world's second biggest market, economically they are basically making a very foolish decision. So all those political security concerns and suspicions can be dealt separately, but they are not going to undermine the economic opportunities that China offers. And South Korea has more than doubled its exports to China during the last decade, and so is Thailand, Malaysia, all ASEAN countries. Exports have doubled into Chinese market. Whereas South Asia, we are sitting here and Sri Lanka, for example, does not trade with Asia in any significant scale, and we fail to separate our political and security concerns from economic concerns. And I think going forward, that is a discussion Sri Lanka should have, and that is a policy shift we need to have.
What's the way forward for Sri Lanka?
So basically, even when we are talking about India, when we talk about strategic location, we often think our strategic location is this closeness to east-west shipping route. Not really. It is access to India, it is access to Indian subcontinent, and our proximity to India that gives us huge economic potential, which we are not exploiting because of our historical and various suspicions and security concerns we have have with India. And like Harinder said, we can learn from East Asia. How do they manage, despite none of them love China? They do have a lot of fears about China's rise, but at the same time, that has not prevented them from economically integrating with China and benefiting from China's growth.
Thank you very much, Subhashini. George, my final question to you for tonight. We spoke of better enabling diplomats and better educating policymakers. I'd like to take the example of the free trade agreement entered into between the Sri Lankan and Singaporean governments recently, where professional bodies came on this very show and said that their recommendations, their consultations weren't really considered in the final document, and they expressed harsh displeasure regarding it. So, to avoid situations like this, to ensure that our country's national interests, domestic interests are put first, who needs to make the calls?
It obviously falls within the remit of those who are formulating policy. It is the leaders who the responsibility falls fairly and squarely on their shoulders at that point, in being able to identify people, personalities, who are going to be capable to contribute to the final documentation, in terms of preparing our negotiators before they go out there for the negotiation, understanding the other side that we are negotiating with, understanding points of view from their perspective, putting ourselves into their shoes. It's not always something that we need to do in identifying what is only ours and what are we trying to achieve out of it. We need to understand the other side and what arguments they are going to be bringing up against us at that point. When we are making this call at this point, we really need to be alert, we need to be aware, we need to be mindful of the fact that all countries, irrespective of where they may be located, have certain fixated positions on what they want to achieve. We need to have a similar position. We need to be anchored. We need to be anchored on this concept of, are we going to be becoming an ever-blossoming hub? Dr. Vidanage also talked about the hub concept. We've been a hub for centuries. The Portuguese, the Dutch and the British came here because we were a hub, because we were attractive, because we were necessary. They would not have come here otherwise. So it's not a new concept, but a revival of an old concept which has been very much a part and parcel of our infrastructure within the country. We need to be identifying the fact that where are we going in the next 5 years, 10 years, at least in the next 10 years. We need to have what would be identified as a foreign policy formula. We need to first identify our neighborhood, the Indian Ocean region. This has got to be paramount. We have got to have key strategic partnerships with associations around the world. Obviously, we work very closely with the United Nations. We could have lots of potential with the African Union. Afro-Asian unity has been a concept which has been discussed over several decades now. We need to be working very closely with the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is growing in potential given what is happening with Brexit and Britain's position. The Commonwealth is going to gain momentum. We're also going to see potential, for example, in ASEAN, which is, after all, in our immediate vicinity. It has huge potential. We can do so much more in terms of interaction with ASEAN. We missed out on the chance in '67. We've tried in 2007 through the ARF to become closer to those countries. We can at least become an observer. And fifthly, we need to have extremely close partnerships with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The SCO is growing as an entity, as a military alliance, an economic alliance, whatever you want to label it. It is a grouping that is going to have significant emphasis, significant bearings on South Asia in times to come. And we need to have priority lists of countries that are going to be key partners in key regions around the world. Those are going to be our gateways into those regions.
What if the existing policymakers don't have the necessary skill set to make these decisions, George?
Well, that is beyond my control. Of course, it remains...
I think we're kind of in that situation, so it's kind of reality-based.
Because what we've got to understand is, you mentioned in your earlier question sometime earlier in the program, you talked about personalities and their importance, and I mentioned the diplomat. Of course, leaders also have played a very critical role. We've had partnerships which have been extremely favorable towards Sri Lanka. But of course, you know, when the pendulum sways too much to one extreme, there's a huge likelihood that it is going to sway in the other extreme. And we've had that through experience. We need used to have returned back to this concept of the middle path, virtually taking a bit from religious ideology, coming into the political framework here, foreign policy formulation, being able to understand nuances in our interactions with international leaders, understand nuances in their particular regions. Not everything that is said is actually as clearly understood in black and white. There's a lot of areas in the grey. I mean, we go back to 2016 and there was a classic statement that was made by the Chinese president when Prime Minister Wickremesinghe visited China for the first time, and he said, "We are with the people of Sri Lanka." Now this is something that we've got to understand. They understand the structure within this country. This is a democracy. The people decide on who comes into power. They will work with whoever is in power. Now at the end of the day, the remit then falls once again on the people of this country to elect leaders who are going to be responsible for this country. And no leader comes into power, and I mean we could have a much longer debate on this, with the willful intention of ruining the country or taking the country downhill. Everybody wants to leave a legacy at the end of the day. You want to make some kind of worthwhile contribution. You want to leave something behind. You want to make your mark. And this is, and probably somewhere along the line things don't exactly plan out the way you wanted them to. But by and large, at least when it comes to the short to medium term, we need to start formulating policies which are going to be pragmatic in terms of our strategy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, George Cook, for that. Final question for tonight, Dr. Harinder Vidanage. Doctor, sometimes certain factions, certain political factions use this to stir up divisions among the people, to bring in doubt. They say that national security is affected, that sovereignty is affected because of the Sri Lankan government's willingness to engage so callously with countries such as China. How do you respond to these kinds of allegations? Because this is information that is widely then disseminated among the masses.
Let me try to answer you, but I think my answer would not please anyone here, but let me make it very clear. The idea that Sri Lanka is in a strategic location, the fact that we are in a strategic location, the value, I mean, we can argue with trade, the idea that we have to be in multiple organizations, I respect that, I think it's important, but every country which is interested in Sri Lanka is not interested because of our market potential. It's interested because of our security potential, right? So security, we are eternally tied to this aspect of security, whether you like it or not, right? So that is why Sri Lankan policymakers can create such a phobia, a chaotic picture of Sri Lanka's insecurity, because we are insecure. You have to give credit to them, they're right about it, but that ends there. What they should be doing is making sure our security is safeguarded. So we need to be involved in a form of security diplomacy that we have not done yet so far.
Right.
The best security diplomacy which is being done at the moment is done by Singapore. For example, Asia's security fulcrum should be Sri Lanka, not Singapore. But if you look at Singapore now, the security dialogues that are taking place about the whole of Asia is done in the Shangri-La dialogue. It is happening every year. So Sri Lanka should create, I mean, if you want the rest of the world, the powers to converge in Sri Lanka, we have to create the ideal security forums, the spaces. I think trade is so important, but we should not forget this whole idea of strategic importance comes not because of the economic vitality. It is there, but because of the security connotation. It is paramount, it's something we cannot ignore or escape. So we need to have that going.
Are you confident that Sri Lanka has what it takes to progress towards effective, sustainable and safe development given the current context?
Well, that's all wishful thinking. But I think we have to develop. It's going to happen. But I don't know if it's sustainable or not. Because we have to be also sensitive to the fact that we are in a post-conflict transformation society. We are in a society which is still struggling to deal with our own ghosts in our past. So any government, irrespective of whether it's the current one, past one, or the ones that are going to come in the future, is going to face this challenge. So one way of getting out of it is having a pragmatic development strategy in play. That's important. That pragmatic development strategy has to be backed by a pragmatic security strategy, which entails the need of a pragmatic foreign policy strategy, which George was talking about. So so those building blocks had to be done, be made soon. If not, everybody is going to lose, irrespective of which political party, which leader you like. We are all going to lose because. And last thing, we all wrap up. We need to compete. There is no competition among us. We are not competing. We should compete with Singapore. We should compete with countries. When we only have a competitor, will we start moving ahead? If not, we are still all relaxed, laid back, because we are not competitive. I'll rest it there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Harinda Vidanage, Director, Bandaranaike Centre for International Studies, Subhashini Abesinghe, Research Director, Verite Research, George Cook, former diplomat and Deputy Director of the Bandaranaike Centre for International Studies. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your perspectives and your expertise. Dr. Vidanage and George, thank you for engaging with the educational system of this country, because this is something we really require. And thank you, Subhashini, for your pivotal role in this research institution. Thank you to also Charita Fernando and Nabi Majid for asking just the right questions. Now today we spoke of the regional dominance of China and how Sri Lanka really needs to take it up a couple of notches to capitalize on the opportunities on the one hand and to dodge the threats. We looked at the disconnect between policymakers and their ability oftentimes or inability to best protect the country's interests. We spoke also of the need of the government to bridge the gap between academia on the one hand and the policymakers to ensure that the right decisions are taken. Thank you for your contributions, your questions asked on this show as well. Thank you very much. Good night.